Welcome everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm excited to introduce our presentation on the nationalist movement in Indo-China. This is the first of 18 slides, and over the course of this talk, we'll explore the key events, figures, and impacts of this important movement. So let's get started. Let's take a moment to look at the different ways societies have approached modernization beyond just the Western model. We'll explore how Japan and China, for example, each took unique paths toward becoming modern nations. Then, we'll consider what it means to talk about being modern, how societies present themselves and perceive their modern identity. We'll also examine the impact of colonial domination and the various forms of resistance that emerged in response. The end of war is another crucial point, as it often reshapes national priorities and ideas of modernization. Next, we'll look at how visions of modernization were constructed, what leaders and thinkers envisioned for their societies. The dilemma of colonial education is also key, how colonial powers used education as a tool for both control and resistance. Emerging from the shadow of China highlights how newer nations sought independence and their own paths. We'll also discuss the idea of national heroes and how they inspire movements toward modern nationhood. Hygiene, disease, and daily acts of resistance reveal the everyday struggles and resilience of colonized peoples. The Communist movement and Vietnamese nationalism show how political ideologies fueled resistance and aspirations for independence. We'll also question whether colonies should be developed or left to evolve on their own, and look at resistance within colonial schools as a form of protest. Finally, this slide sets the stage for understanding the overall theme of how colonized nations navigated the complex journey toward modernity, often through a mix of adaptation, resistance, and redefining their identities. Now, let's explore some of the key themes that shaped Vietnam's path forward after the end of the war. First, we see how the nation and its heroes played a crucial role in defining Vietnamese identity and resilience during this period. These figures and stories helped inspire a sense of unity and pride among the people. Next, we'll look at the Communist movement and how it intertwined with Vietnamese nationalism. This was a complex relationship, one where the struggle for independence was closely linked with the rise of communist ideals, shaping the country's political future. Moving on, the vision of modernization was a major goal for Vietnam. It wasn't just about economic growth, but also about transforming society, improving infrastructure, education, and technology to build a stronger, more self-reliant nation. Religion and anti-colonialism also played important roles. Religious beliefs often provided a sense of community and continuity, even as anti-colonial sentiments fueled the push for independence and resistance against foreign influence. We then see how hygiene, disease, and everyday resistance intersected, ordinary people fighting to improve their lives in tangible ways, often challenging colonial authorities through small acts of defiance related to health and sanitation. The dilemma of colonial education is another critical point. Education was both a tool of colonial control and a potential pathway to empowerment. Vietnamese students and intellectuals had to navigate this complex environment, seeking knowledge while resisting cultural dominance. Finally, Vietnam's emergence from the shadow of China signifies a reclaiming of its own identity and sovereignty. It's about stepping out from under the influence of its powerful neighbor and establishing a distinct national presence on the world stage. All these themes connect deeply to the overall story of Vietnam's struggle for independence, modernization, and self-determination. They highlight the multifaceted nature of this pivotal period in Vietnamese history. In 1945, Vietnam gained independence from colonial rule, marking a significant turning point in its history. However, establishing a fully sovereign state took another 3 decades, during which the Republic of Vietnam was formed. This period was crucial in shaping the nation as we know it today. The rise of nationalism in Indo-China was deeply rooted in the colonial context, and Vietnam played a central role in these discussions. it was a time when different communities within Vietnam united with a common goal: to fight against colonialism. Their collective efforts laid the foundation for the modern nation, emphasizing the importance of unity and shared identity in overcoming external domination. This history highlights how Vietnam's path to independence was a gradual process, driven by a strong sense of national pride and community collaboration, which continue to influence its development today. Indo-China, as you might know, is essentially made up of three key countries: Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. These regions have a long history of influence from China, which has shaped their culture, society, and even political systems over centuries. Even after gaining independence, Vietnam, in particular, continued to follow the Chinese style of government and retained many cultural ties. Additionally, Vietnam was an important part of the maritime Silk Route, which was not just about trading goods, but also about exchanging ideas and connecting people across regions. This historical backdrop is crucial because it shows how deeply intertwined these countries were with China, and how they began to emerge from that shadow, forging their own identities and paths forward. This journey of independence and cultural evolution is a key part of understanding the broader theme of regional transformation we're exploring today. In the years that followed, we see a shift in Vietnamese history, where the Vietnamese people began to lose their previous positions of power. French rule started to take control over all aspects of life in the country, from administration to daily affairs. This period also saw the rise of a nationalist movement, which developed as a response to French domination, with local people fighting to reclaim their independence. It all began in 1858, when French traders arrived in Vietnam. By the 1880s, they had established control over the administrative and political systems in northern Vietnam. After the French-China War in 1887, Vietnam was divided into regions called Tonkin and Annam, both under French control. This led to the formation of what was known as Indo-China, a colonial entity under French rule. This period of French control, both economically and militarily, brought significant changes to Vietnamese culture. You can imagine how these external influences began to reshape traditional ways of life. Amidst this, a sense of nationalism started to grow within Vietnam. Different segments of society began to unite in their struggle against French domination, fueling the movement for independence. This entire chapter highlights how colonial domination impacted Vietnam deeply, sparking resistance and fostering a strong sense of national identity that would continue to develop in the years ahead. Now, let's look at the construction of the Trans-Indo-China Rail Network. This was a major development that aimed to connect the northern and southern regions of Vietnam and China, facilitating movement and trade across these areas. Alongside this, we saw increased infrastructural development in Vietnam, particularly in places like Siam, which is modern-day Thailand, and the Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh. These improvements helped foster business growth and economic activity. Vietnam, during this period, became a significant exporter of rice. In fact, it exported about 2/3 of its rice production. By 1931, Vietnam had risen to become the third largest rice exporter in the world, which highlights how the infrastructure development under French rule supported agricultural exports and economic expansion. The development of transportation and infrastructure also played a strategic role. It allowed for the efficient movement of military garrisons, ensuring control over the entire region. This was crucial for maintaining French dominance and security. Furthermore, colonies like Vietnam were seen as vital sources of natural resources and other essential goods. To support this, the French government invested in building canals and drainage systems, improving irrigation, and expanding cultivable land. These efforts underscore why the French considered their colonies necessary, not just for economic benefits, but also for strategic and resource security. So overall, the French viewed their colonies as essential for resource extraction, economic growth, and regional control, which all contributed to their broader imperial objectives. So let's take a closer look at the colonial economy in Vietnam. It was mainly centered around rice cultivation and rubber plantations, which were owned by the French and a small Vietnamese elite. To support these industries, infrastructure like railways and ports were developed, primarily to facilitate the export of these goods. Indentured Vietnamese labor was widely used, especially in the rubber plantations, which highlights the exploitative labor practices of that time. Interestingly, French rule didn't really focus on spreading industrialization in Vietnam. Instead, it allowed landlordism to thrive, which contributed to a decline in the overall standard of living for many Vietnamese people. However, as the economy developed, we did see some improvements in the standard of living, and demand for goods increased. This, in turn, expanded the market for French businesses operating there. Despite these economic shifts, there was a clear need for land reform and better infrastructure development to support the broader growth of Vietnam. This brings us to an important question: should colonies be developed? Considering what we've discussed, development can bring economic growth and increased living standards, but it also raises questions about who benefits from that development and at what cost. This slide ties into the overall theme of whether colonial development truly serves the interests of the local population or merely benefits the colonial powers. French rule in Vietnam didn't just focus on economic exploration. It also introduced a modern way of living to the local people. However, this modernization often came at a cost, sometimes destroying important local culture and traditions. Education was seen as the key to modernizing the population, but there was a lot of confusion among the French rulers about what level of education was appropriate. They wanted to promote progress, but at the same time, they were cautious about losing control. To protect French employment opportunities and manage the concerns raised by the educated Vietnamese, the French authorities did not grant full access to higher education for the locals. This created a real dilemma: how to modernize without giving too much power or independence to the Vietnamese through education. It's a complex balance between progress and control that reflects the broader challenges of colonial rule. On this slide, we're looking at the education system that was introduced during this period. It included classes in science, hygiene, and French. But what's important to understand is that this education wasn't enough just to teach science or Western ideas. To truly be considered modern, the Vietnamese also had to look modern. This idea of looking modern was crucial because it helped create what was called an Asiatic French, a version of the Vietnamese that was firmly tied to European French ideals. It was about shaping a perception, a way of appearing modern and aligned with European standards. Now, the way the Vietnamese were portrayed played a big role here. They were seen as primitive and backward, capable of manual labor, yes, but not of intellectual reflection. This was a way of reinforcing colonial stereotypes, that they could work in the fields but couldn't govern themselves or engage in creative thinking. In fact, they were often described as skilled copyists, good at imitating, but not at original or creative work. This distinction was important because it justified the colonial narrative that they needed guidance and control from the Europeans. So overall, this slide highlights how education and appearance were used as tools to shape perceptions of modernity, creating a dichotomy where physical labor was valued, but intellectual and creative capacities were seen as limited. This ties into the broader theme of how colonial power was maintained through cultural and visual representations. On this slide, we're looking at how the colonial education system sought to shape Vietnamese perceptions and values. Essentially, it aimed to promote the idea that French civilization was superior, while making the Vietnamese see themselves as inferior. This created a kind of master-slave mentality among the people, which was part of a broader struggle against colonial rule and for independence. Now, because of these influences, many Vietnamese faced challenges when trying to qualify for white-collar jobs. There was a strong belief that educated people had a duty to fight for society's benefit, driven by patriotic feelings. During the 1920s, students started forming various political parties and publishing nationalist journals, like the Annan Student. These activities turned schools into key battlegrounds, not just for education, but also for political and cultural resistance. A notable example of this resistance was the 1926 protest at the Saigon Native Girls' School. The principal, who was a French colonist, expelled some students, which sparked outrage. The government was eventually compelled to reinstate those students, showing how strong the movement was becoming. What's important to recognize is that teachers and students didn't just passively accept the curriculum they were given. There was open opposition at times and silent resistance at others. Vietnamese teachers often quietly modified textbooks or criticized what was written, making it harder for colonial authorities to control what was actually being taught. So, in essence, schools became more than just places of learning. They became arenas for political activism and cultural resistance. This slide highlights the contradictions within their so-called civilizing mission. You see, the rat catchers would often just clip the rats' tails and then release them back into the city. Some people actually started raising rats themselves to earn a bounty, which shows how ineffective and ironic these measures were. In 1902, the French hired Vietnamese workers and paid them for each rat they caught. But, as you might imagine, the dirty work of entering the sewers was tough. When these workers realized they could band together, they started negotiating for higher bounties. As a result, the French had no choice but to scrap the bounty program altogether. Now, this effort to control rats didn't just fail to eliminate the problem, it actually worsened social conflicts. The spread of disease became a major issue, especially because the native quarter was left without modern facilities. During heavy rains or floods, the streets would overflow, and this contributed to the spread of the plague. And let's not forget, the sewer system, which was supposed to help, actually served as a highway for rats to move freely around the city. So, in a way, the very infrastructure meant to clean up the city became a major part of the problem, spreading disease and heightening social tensions. The second school believed that the Vietnamese had to learn from the West, but at the same time, they needed to resist Western domination. They saw the importance of modernization, but also wanted to preserve Vietnamese identity. Now, Phan Chu Trinh, who lived from 1871 to 1926, had a very different view. He was strongly opposed to monarchy and was a proponent of establishing a democratic republic. His ideas focused on political reform and national independence through democratic principles. On the other hand, Phan Boi Chau, who lived from 1867 to 1940, took a more strategic approach. In 1903, he formed the Revolution Society, or Dai Tan Hoi, with Prince Quang Do as the leader. Chau was influenced by Chinese reformers like Liang Qichao, and he even wrote a book called History of the Loss of Vietnam. Chau believed that first, the French needed to be driven out, and only then should Vietnam restore its monarchy. Both thinkers agreed that Vietnamese traditions needed to be strengthened to resist Western domination, but their methods and visions for the future differed significantly. These differing opinions highlight the complex debates about how Vietnam should modernize and maintain its independence during this period. When Sun Yat-sen overthrew the monarchy in China in 1911, it marked a significant turning point in Chinese history. This inspired similar movements elsewhere, like in Vietnam, where a new association called the Association for Restoration of Vietnam was formed. Their main goal was to establish a democratic republic and also to restore a constitutional monarchy in Vietnam. Meanwhile, some 300 Vietnamese students traveled to Japan around 1907 and 1908 to get a modern education. Their hope was to eventually drive out the French colonial rulers and restore the Nguyen dynasty. They sought Japanese support and even set up a restoration society in Tokyo to coordinate their efforts. However, after 1908, things didn't go as planned. The Japanese authorities closed down the society, viewing it as a threat, and many of these students, including Phan Boi Chau, were forced into exile in China and Thailand. This reflects a broader theme in our discussion today: how different countries sought to modernize and resist colonial rule through various political and revolutionary means. Japan and China, for example, took different paths of modernization, which we'll explore further. Let's take a closer look at the rise of the Communist movement and Vietnamese nationalism. The fear of communism in the United States led to their intervention in Vietnam, which resulted in a bitter war from 1965 to 1972. Fortunately, peace was finally restored in 1974. During this period, Vietnam was divided into North and South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh became the leader in the North, while Bao Dai ruled the South. This division actually fueled conflict, and eventually, Bao Dai was overthrown by Ngo Dinh Diem. The South then united and formed the National Liberation Front, or NLF, which fought for unification under Ho Chi Minh's leadership. A key event in this history is the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. More than 16,000 French soldiers were either killed or captured, and the entire French command staff, including generals and officers, was taken prisoner. This was a decisive defeat that marked the end of French colonial rule in Vietnam. Now, looking at Vietnamese nationalism, the French had set up a puppet regime under Bao Dai. But after years of fighting, the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, and Vietnam's independence movement gained momentum. Before the Japanese occupation in 1940, Vietnam was under French control. During the occupation, the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, fought Japanese forces, recaptured Hanoi, and in September 1943, Ho Chi Minh became the chairman of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was born in central Vietnam and dedicated his life to independence. He met leaders like Lenin and spent many years in Europe, Thailand, and China. After about 30 years abroad, he returned to Vietnam in May 1941 and soon became the president of the Vietnam Democratic Republic. The events of the Great Depression in the 1930s had a big impact on Vietnam, causing unemployment, debts, and rural uprisings. During this turbulent time, Ho Chi Minh emerged as a key figure, founding the Vietnamese Communist Party in 1930, inspired by European communist ideas. So, in essence, Ho Chi Minh not only led the fight for independence, but also became a symbol of Vietnamese nationalism and communist movement. His leadership was crucial in shaping Vietnam's path towards independence and unification. In the 1960s, we see a powerful image of women as young, brave, and dedicated individuals. They were portrayed as warriors and workers, symbolizing strength and resilience. But then, in the 1970s, as the war was nearing its end, that image shifted from the warrior woman to the worker woman. This change reflects how societal roles and perceptions evolved during that period. Interestingly, women in Vietnam didn't have much of a role in public life historically, but the ongoing freedom struggle started to reshape how women were viewed. Figures like the Trung sisters, who lived from 39 to 43 CE, became iconic symbols of patriotism and heroism. Their legacy inspired future generations, just as Trieu in the 3rd century CE did. So these stories and images of women, whether as warriors or heroines, are central to understanding the broader theme of national identity and heroism. They show how women's roles, both in history and in the struggle for independence, have contributed significantly to shaping Vietnam's national narrative. On 30 April 1975, a pivotal moment in history occurred when the North Liberation Front, or NLF, took control of the presidential palace in Saigon. This event marked the unification of Vietnam under communist rule, effectively ending the long and turbulent conflict. It was a significant turning point that symbolized the failure of the United States to achieve its objectives in the Vietnam War. You see, despite years of effort, the U.S. was unable to prevent the spread of communism in Vietnam, which was the core goal of their involvement. Interestingly, this war is often called the First Television War because it was the first conflict widely broadcast into people's homes, shaping public opinion and perceptions worldwide. As we wrap up, remember that the end of the Vietnam War not only changed the political landscape of Southeast Asia, but also had lasting impacts on American foreign policy and military strategy. It's a powerful reminder of how complex and far-reaching the consequences of war can be. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I truly appreciate your engagement and interest in the topics we've covered. Remember, the key points we've discussed are all about understanding the importance of effective communication, strategic planning, and continuous improvement. These concepts are the foundation for success in any project or endeavor. I hope you leave here with new insights and practical ideas to apply in your own work. Again, thank you for being such a great audience, and I look forward to seeing how you put these ideas into action.